In 1983, President Ronald Reagan highlighted the importance of a strong U.S. military to defend freedom around the world.
It's up to us, in our time, to choose and choose wisely between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best while the enemies of freedom grow stronger day by day.
Decades later, as freedom faces new enemies, America's might has diminished, and we need another leader who will defend liberty once again. That is the call of our guest tonight. We are pleased to welcome former Vice President Dick Cheney, along with his daughter Liz Cheney, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Fox News contributor. They are the co-authors of a new book called Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Powerful America. And we're really honored to have both of you here today. It's good to see you.
Fun to be here.
In reading through the book yesterday, one of the things I wanted to ask you as we set the scene before we go around the table here is, the subtitle is Why the World Needs a Powerful America. What is the risk if the world doesn't have a powerful America?
Well, I think that's a perfect question, Dana, because you have to think about what a world looks like in which it's not America that sets, the game rules, essentially. A world in which, perhaps Iran is ascendant, Russia is ascendant, China is ascendant, a world in which ISIS is running rampant. And frankly, you see a lot of that today. But there are people who say, why does America have to do this? Let's just let Europe do it. And what you're seeing in the Middle East, for example, is when America withdraws, Europe doesn't fill the vacuum, ISIS does, Iran does.
Mr. Vice President, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think it's part of the message that we try to convey. Of course, we tell the story beginning with World War II and then the Cold War and the way in which America really became the sole superpower in the world and all that we accomplished, especially during the 20th century, and how different things are today, primarily because consensus that existed then, Republican and Democrat alike, FDR, Harry Truman, Jack Kennedy on the one hand, Ronald Reagan, Jerry Ford, the Bushes on the other, believed in a strong America, an exceptional America, an America that really set the stage and was the defender of freedom, and that's no longer the case, that Barack Obama doesn't share those views.
Eric, you want to kick it off?
Mr. Vice President, so I was in the oil pits downtown when Gulf War I happened and when Gulf War II happened. After the 1990-1991 Gulf War, you guys decided not to go in and take Saddam Hussein out. The decision was made differently in 2003. What changed in that period?
Well, the big difference was 9/11. In the first Gulf War, there was an agreement. We had allies from all over that part of the world, and the mission basically was to go in and liberate Kuwait and drive him back into Iraq. Nobody argued that we should do any more than that. In the meantime, you fast forward then 12 years. By then, we'd had 9/11. We'd seen the United States attacked, the worst attack in our history, worse than Pearl Harbor, 3,000 dead Americans, etc. And we were concerned then, very concerned, that the next mass casualty attack might well be with deadlier weapons. And when you start to look at where deadlier weapons existed and had been developed and used in the past, Iraq was the center of it. Not Barack Obama, excuse me, misspoke.
Saddam Hussein.
Can I just follow up? Again, knowing we've had this question come up quite often, knowing what you know now with what happened in the aftermath, was that the right decision?
I think it was. It wasn't. There was never any suggestion that we ought to go on. Nobody was arguing that was the right course of action. We had United Nations support for what we were doing. The Congress had approved it overwhelmingly. We had a lot of allies that had signed on from that part of the world. And we'd reached the point where we'd achieved our objective after about 100 hours of ground war and several weeks of bombing. And that's what we said we were going to do. We did it and we stopped.
Andrea.
This is perhaps the most compelling case that I've read against the Iran deal that's in the headlines. You articulate it just really in a very adept and incredible way. And you bring up Obama's 2009 Cairo speech, and you quote the line where he said, "No single nation should pick and choose which nations hold nuclear weapons." And then you write, "It is though President Obama sees no moral difference between Iranian nuclear weapons and an American one." Do you believe that the president is allowing Iran to get this weapon deliberately, and you see that he conflates us on the same moral plane?
I think that the president, and you've pointed out a line from that speech that people often don't talk about and have ignored. I think the president fundamentally misunderstands the importance of America maintaining nuclear supremacy. And this is one of those places where throughout history, Republicans and Democrats alike have spoken about it. He views all nuclear weapons as bad. And I think he couples that with this idea that somehow Iran should be welcomed as a leader into the Middle East. He said that repeatedly, that they need to be welcomed in to play their rightful role. Not understanding that they are, in fact, apparently not understanding the world's worst state sponsor of terror, and that this deal is going to not just give them a pathway to nuclear weapons, to a nuclear arsenal, but hundreds of billions of dollars. And it will remove the restrictions on their conventional weapons imports, remove restrictions on their ballistic missile program. So you've got to sort of step back here and say, anyone who's willing to accept this deal that he has put on the table, it's hard to imagine that they have grave concerns about an Iranian nuclear weapon, given that the deal will result in an Iranian arsenal.
And you write almost as if you believe that they will use it.
Well, I think our concern is that you will have a proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, others who live in the area, especially Sunni countries, are not going to abide by a situation where the Iranians have nuclear weapons and they don't. So I think it will, in fact, lead to the proliferation of weapons. And when you think about, say, 5, 10, 15 years down the road, that part of the world, very unstable to begin with, where you've got terrorist organizations, sometimes toppling governments. Imagine what would have happened if Muammar Gaddafi, instead of surrendering his nuclear materials to us after we took down Saddam, had kept him and completed the program and then fell and ISIS moved in and took over. They'd have a nuclear weapon today. So I think the possibility of a nuclear conflict or a conflict involving the use of nuclear weapons is significantly enhanced by what's happening here. I think the risk is greater than any time since World War II.
The other thing that the president seems not to recognize is the value of our nuclear arsenal as a deterrent. And the extent to which, if you look at those countries in the Middle East, our ability to say to them, you don't need your own nuclear program because we will provide a nuclear umbrella for you, is severely diminished. And frankly, at this point, because of the cuts that he's made, on top of the fact that we're enabling an Iranian program, none of those countries in the region, frankly, feel they can count on us for that anymore.
Gutfeld.
Well, I get the impression that President Obama, he couldn't negotiate a hallway. And so I think he got good cop, bad copped by Iran. So when you meet with Iran, you meet with two sides, like a married couple where one spouse is normal and the other one's crazy. And that's what he does. So that when he meets, the pragmatists go, hey, look, we got these nutty Ayatollahs over here. If we can get this thing through, everything will be fine, but we got to do it now. So he actually plays the Ayatollahs against Obama, and Obama falls for it. That's why I think this happened, is I think they always use this good cop, bad cop thing. But that's not my question. That was just a comment. I want to talk about a different threat. I think there's a growing threat of non-state actors who can now murder thousands. We're no longer talking about countries, but we're talking small groups of people who can get through technology certain methods that can kill many, many people. And what I worry about, and I see it as a big blind spot, is a preoccupation with our so-called privacy breaches. We're mistaking our own security as something apart from our own society, that we're seeing our security, our NSA programs, our intel as somehow oppositional to our own country. And I think that's a huge blind spot, thanks to our traitor Snowden, who should hang. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
No, I think you're right. And I noticed the other day, for example, when Congress was debating a change in the NSA program, where the data is no longer going to be held by the government, it'll be held by the companies. In the middle of all of that debate, where we were reducing and limiting our capacity under the NSA program, it was disclosed that China had tapped into our computers and had Dana's personnel records, my personal records, anybody who ever worked for the federal government, stole that background material, as Congress is figuring out a way to limit our capacity to defend ourselves against exactly that sort of thing. Big mistake.
Thankfully, only her emails were about dogs.
For convenience, I only use my government account.
Yes.
Actually, that was how I dealt with convenience. We're going to talk about that.
And you actually do yoga.
I do. I know. Actually, I don't email about it though, but I might start. Juan Williams, get yourself in here.
Well, how you doing? Are you okay?
I'm great.
Yeah.
I was just back for a checkup on the 3rd year anniversary of my heart transplant, and everything was working great.
Amazing.
Well, I don't know. I tell you, I get a charge whenever I see Liz, so maybe you I don't know, your heart.
Juan, what are you doing?
Flirty. Juan. He's buttering you up before his tough question.
Here's a tough question. I'm going to give you guys a tough question because the rest of these guys, I don't know. This is not Washington.
Just ask him how he was.
How he was?
And then you hit on his daughter.
I figured I'd give his heart a shock. All right. So last month, President Obama, right? You talk about this deal, this Iran deal, that's in the news today, and apparently now, it's going to be a fait accompli. You say it's a train wreck. You say maybe he's doing it just for his legacy, but that it's going to lead to the proliferation you were talking about earlier. So here's President Obama last month at AU, American University, and he says, and if the rhetoric in all the ads and opposition, if it sounds familiar, it's because many of the same people who argue for the war in Iraq are now making the case against the Iran nuclear deal. And I thought, he's talking about Dick Cheney. So if people say, well, Dick Cheney was wrong about Iraq, why should they listen to you on Iran?
Because I was right about Iraq.
Boy, I don't think most Americans agree on that.
Well, I think if you look at the track record here now of what happened, our objective was to take down Saddam Hussein. We did it. The world's a much better place without him. To argue that we shouldn't have done it, you've got to argue that Saddam Hussein would still be in power in Iraq. Secondly, when we took down Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi saw what we were doing. And he surrendered, announced, and then delivered his centrifuges, his uranium feedstock, and his weapons design. When we took that down and eliminated that threat, then we went after A.Q. Khan, who had supplied that material to Gaddafi. And he was the founder of the Pakistani program, but he was in a black market operation and selling nuclear materials to the North Koreans, to the Iranians, to the Libyans. We took down his operation, too. So we achieved a lot when we went into Iraq. A lot of people don't like to talk about the rest of it, but we did the right thing then, and I'm convinced now that it was absolutely the right thing.
Are we in a safer, is the globe safer now without Gaddafi and Hussein in power? Some would say that maybe it would be a safer place with them intact.
If they had nuclear weapons?
No. Well, I mean,
Gaddafi was on the road. He had the materials he needed to develop nuclear capability. He got it from...
Do we know that, though?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes. We actually got the material and brought it back.
Do we not? Are we not in a globe in a world where the Middle East is so unstable that even, as Greg points out, something happens in Iran, there's a nuclear running fest for nuclear weapons throughout the region.
But the reason that it's like that, Eric, is because of the policies of President Obama. Think about what Iraq looked like on January 20th, 2009, when President Obama took the oath of office and was sworn in. Iraq was stable. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had largely been defeated. The Shiite militias had largely been defeated. We are where we are today, and you're right. We've got a potential explosion happening every day across the Middle East because things are so unstable. But the thing to remember is a vote for this deal is not a vote for peace. This deal makes war more likely. If you think about everything that it unleashes...
Liz, that part I agree with. My concern is that when we had dictators in these countries, these dictatorships, foreign countries, crazy people, they at least kept the people at peace, and they didn't necessarily look to kill everyone.
Eric. We had the example in Libya, Gaddafi, nuclear program. We had Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He had a nuclear program in 81. The Israelis took it out. He had a program in 91. We took it out with Desert Storm. While we were involved during our time in office, the North Koreans built a reactor for the Syrians up at Al-Kabar in eastern Syria. The Israelis took it out. Military force, or the credible threat of military force, was responsible for ending a lot of those nuclear programs that were in the works. But I think if we had not been involved over there, if the Israelis had not been as aggressive as they've been, we'd be in bigger trouble now than we are. What I worry about is I think Obama was never serious about a military option. I think that's why he ended up having to give away the store, because, in fact, the Iranians never believed he'd ever use force.